All right, guys. Today's topic is economy in East Asia. This is one of my favorite topics to discuss, so let's get into it. I will be providing these slides for you because I've embedded a lot of links in here to some very interesting videos. I definitely think you guys should check them out. So the first thing we need to understand is what is gross domestic product. We call it GDP. It is the market value of all finished goods and services produced within a country in a year. Some of my personal problems with this, because of the global economy, how things are built, things aren't built in just one country, but the country who finishes that product gets the marker for their entire GDP off of that one industry. And it also uses what's called indicators because there's so much data to collect. If they're going to try to figure out, well, how many computers were built in America, they're just going to look at like Microsoft and get a good general idea and then apply that for the rest of the country. So for the most part, GDP is not super accurate. But this link right here shows you a video comparing Korea, China, Japan, and the US and India for the most part. Great Britain's in there for a while, and how their economies shifted. It's actually a really cool video. It's like 4 minutes long, but you can skip through it. It's worth the watch. Next up, I'm going to start in China. We're going to talk about the China's Belt and Road Initiative. So what this is this was started in 2013. It is a plan to bridge China to pretty much a large portion of the world, 30% of the global GDP, 62% of the world's population, which spreads through 3 continents. And it also connects China and 75% of the energy producers for them. So it's really to secure energy and to trade with other people. The 3 concepts that the Belt and Roads Initiative plans on doing is it is there to increase trade, obviously by connecting people, infrastructure, by building roads and ports all over the world or through these 3 countries, to allow China's, ships and their cargo trucks and trains to transport these goods to sell. And it's also there to kind of invest Chinese money into these foreign nations. And that's kind of important because investment of your population really creates a lot of money for one country. Now, an interesting side note is just last week, China overtook the U.S. Well, I guess it was the end of October of 2019, the Chinese overtook Americans high class. So they have more billionaires or Chinese than Americans now. So that just happened. So what are some problems and concern of this? Well, China is lending this money to nations who are not exactly stable or that have a high chance of defaulting on these loans. So this is called a debt trap. So you're going to China is lending money to countries who may not be able to pay it back, because if they default on those loans, China gains control of those ports and roads and services that they had built, this infrastructure, and they actually get a 99-year lease on these items, where they can control those places. And so China kind of expects some of these nations to default, which may hurt them economically, but they gain this advantage in the region that can make them more money eventually. Now, there's also this thing called the String of Pearls, which is pretty much connecting these ports down here, because there's a few more that aren't mentioned here. And what this does is it allows Chinese ships to be stationed in these areas to kind of, put more their military farther away from their mainland. You see a lot of this similar concept in the South China Sea, which we will talk about later. Just a little example, this is a protest that took place in Sri Lanka after they defaulted on their loan and China gained that 99-year lease of their port. So Japan, I want to focus on Japan's debt. So Japan, just going over the brief stuff that we've kind of mentioned already, Japan's economic miracle happened right after World War II. They shifted money from their military to their economic growth. This was prime for Japan because they had a really industrialized nation before World War II. So their population was already prepared for this, where the rest of Asia, they had to kind of learn this culture. So another advantage of Japan's culture for this economic boom was the fact that they had a really good savings culture. So people were very big on saving and investing their money, and the population was extremely hardworking. They literally have a word in their language that denotes someone dying from working too much, which is pretty interesting. Another advantage is they were located in Asia, and that was kind of where communism was spreading. So America focused on them and invested a lot in them, similar to eventually Korea, but really it happened in Japan the most, where the Americans invested a lot in this Japanese economy to try to offset Russia's and eventually China's influence in the region. So in the 1990s, a big problem happened. Their economy started to stagnate. And if you go back and look in 1994, their GDP was roughly $4.9 trillion, which is pretty much what their GDP is today. So that means that they have not really grown as an economy in over 10 years, almost, or 15 years now. I mean, that really takes a toll on the economy, because without getting into too many details, it costs more money. It also is the low birth rate in Japan costs more money because that creates expenses that the Japanese have to take. And also, they are no longer really a leader in technology and industry like they were before. So the debt problem, which is explained in this video, which is where I think you guys should go if you're interested in this. The government is actually borrowing money to stimulate its economy, and the banks are actually paying people to borrow money from it in order to get them to spend more money, which is kind of crazy, but it works. Well, not really, kind of. So it owes roughly $11 trillion USA, which doesn't sound very, very big compared to America's debt of well over twice that. But it is 2.5 times the GDP of Japan. Where if you look at the U.S.'s debt, it's roughly the GDP of 1 year of the U.S. economy. And they are paying interest on those loans, and that means that they have more money to pay in debt for the money that they already are taking out in debt, but they have to borrow more money to pay that back, which is extremely complicated. But for the most part, the main thing you need to know is they can no longer borrow money to get out of debt because they cannot stimulate their economy enough. And industry is having trouble competing with the rest of the world because their industry is just not on top anymore. They don't have the things that the rest of Asia didn't have back then. Now the rest of Asia has these things, and they are just not as competitive. And also their population is exhausted. They are overworked and underpaid for the most part, and they're supporting this entire generation that is retiring. So moving on, let's talk about North Korea's economy. So I want to talk about a weird aspect of North Korea's economy, and we'll get into it. So North Korea's economy is actually growing faster than South Korea's right now. And I mean, that's kind of understandable, seeing that North Korea's economy is so small compared to South Korea. So any gain appears to be much more, even though Korea is making more money as a whole each year than last year. The fact that it's that little bit of money more North Korea makes a much larger impact on their GDP, as far as it looks like a larger growth. So North Korea exports things like coal and seafood, and there's tons of seafood, over $100 million sold to China alone. But this brings up a really great also documentary I've embedded, which is about the ghost ships of these North Korean sailors who wash up on the Japanese shores. And that may be something for someone focusing on Japan. But it really shows how far out the North Koreans are going to find this fish, because it's much harder to get these fish from near the North Korean mainland. So also Russia has increased its trades with North Korea. It's doubled this year. North Korean labor is sent to Russia to work, which is roughly $100 million from just Russia alone, $1.2 to $2.3 billion worldwide. I mean, if you imagine that's a huge amount of money from just lending other countries your population to work. Also, North Korea has a huge and robust military arms trade. They are illegally smuggling weapons constantly all over the planet. Just a couple years ago, there was a entire ship full of RPGs sent to Egypt to be sold illegally. So North Korea also has this weird shadow economy or a gray market, which is a private market that is inside of the country. So we think of communism as a country where all the industry is state-owned, but in just like in China, which is not really a communist state, North Korea is very similar. The businesses, for the most part, are state-owned, but there are, in North Korea, this growing number of private businesses. And they originally sprung up during the famines to kind of bridge the gap between the food that the government was providing for the population, and it was to try to help feed these people. But it eventually has shifted to not just food, but also these items that are illegally acquired and sold. So maybe electronics or cell phones that are not exactly allowed in Korea. Another big weird part of North Korea's economy is they sell and smuggle drugs. So between 1977 and 2003 alone, over 20 diplomats were caught selling drugs. They actually were kind of forced by other party members to sell these drugs around the world to kind of, I guess, subsidize their own living wages and to kind of bring in money for the rest of the country. They also counterfeit pharmaceuticals and sell those. They may possibly be the largest counterfeiter of currencies. They have an entire division of their government dedicated to this called Room 39. I embedded a link here. And in 2001 alone, they made over 100 million fake US dollars, which roughly created $15 to $25 million in surplus money for them. This is an example of these super notes, as they're called, because they're so precise that it's very difficult to find out if they're counterfeit or if they're genuine American dollars. So that's kind of a rough idea of all these topics. Here's some ideas of some things you can discuss in your videos. Feel free to discuss your region's economy, maybe corporations or markets in your region, such as maybe the electronics industry. Maybe you want to talk about specific companies like Toyota, Nintendo, or others. Maybe you want to talk about economic plans like the Belt and Roads Initiative or others. Maybe you want to discuss economic history like the Japan's economic miracle or China's rise to success in their economy. Maybe you want to talk about the trends, the current trends going on there with Japan's stagnation or China's eventual stagnation. They are actually having some economic problems right now. Maybe you want to discuss the trade war between the U.S. and China. Honestly, guys, anything dealing with economies in East Asia, it does not have to be one of the boring topics I discussed, or for the most part, I find very interesting. You can talk about anything. So I look forward to y'all's videos. Don't forget, or your forums, I mean. Don't forget to meet your word counts. All right, y'all have a great week. Thank you.